It's time for justice. The Thomas Simmons story. Thomas "Tommy" Simmons of Kansas City, Missouri, took an offered plea for burglary in 2009. An offered plea is a guilty plea in which a defendant maintains their innocence, but admits that the prosecution's evidence would likely result in a guilty verdict if brought to trial. Mr. Simmons insists that the burglary charges brought against him in 2009 are a direct result of the multi-million-dollar lawsuit he brought against KCPD for a previous wrongful conviction, for which he was imprisoned for 4 years. While Simmons' case details an investigation into a single KCPD officer's practices and actions, its ramifications on the black community are far-reaching. The questions that surface with this investigation are: how many other officers could be involved in these specific incidents, as well as how many other officers could be utilizing the same unlawful and unconstitutional practices. Mr. Simmons' 2009 lawsuit against KCPD stems from a series of unconstitutional actions conducted by officers within the Kansas City Police Department. At the center of Mr. Simmons' lawsuit against KCPD is Sergeant Bradley Lemon. Sergeant Lemon also serves as the current president of the Fraternal Order of Police. In April of 2009, just days after Mr. Simmons filed the lawsuit against KCPD, a tactical team forced entry into his residence. Mr. Simmons believes that this specific police action against him is based upon unlawful, unconstitutional, and warrantless surveillance conducted by KCPD, for which Mr. Simmons is completely convinced to be a retaliatory measure against him because of the lawsuit he had just filed. The evidence of wrongdoing by KCPD includes but is not limited to the following police incident reports. The first fraudulent incident report in question is dated March 26 of 2009, and it was self-approved by Sergeant Lemon 40 days later, on May 5. The second fraudulent incident report is dated March 27 of 2009, and it was self-approved by Sergeant Lemon 30 days later, on April 27. The third fraudulent incident report is dated March 29 of 2009, and it was self-approved by Sergeant Lemon on April 27, along with 2 other incident reports of supposed surveillance on Mr. Simmons. The fourth and final fraudulent incident report is dated March 30 of 2009, and it was self-approved by Sergeant Lemon on the same date as the March 27 and March 29 incident reports. The entire case against Mr. Simmons revolves around faulty incident reports, and unlawful, warrantless and unconstitutional surveillance of Mr. Simmons, by Sergeant Brad Lemon. Sergeant Lemon's evidence against Mr. Simmons included unlawful and warrantless trespass, and unlawful and warrantless placement of a GPS tracking device. Sergeant Lemon presented the manufactured evidence against Mr. Simmons to former Jackson County Assistant District Attorney Don Parsons. With this manufactured evidence along with a statement by Sergeant Lemon that Mr. Simmons would likely be armed and dangerous, a warrant was granted by a 16th District Court judge. Sergeant Lemon has gone on record in saying that he and former Assistant District Attorney Don Parsons were friends during the time of Mr. Simmons' prosecution. A fact that should have been disclosed to the court. But it was not. It's time for justice. The Thomas Simmons story. With the evidence of wrongdoing by KCPD and the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office, Mr. Simmons approached Errol Forte, who was Chief of Police at the time. Chief Forte opened an investigation into the claims of wrongdoing presented to him by Mr. Simmons. Chief Forte found the subsequent findings of the Internal Affairs Unit to be incomplete, so he instructed them to question Sergeant Lemon further, and to specifically ask Sergeant Lemon about who authorized him to self-approve his own incident reports, as well as to clarify the relationship he had with Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Don Parsons at the time of Mr. Simmons' prosecution. Within a few months of requesting that the Internal Affairs Unit dig deeper, Chief Forte abruptly retired as Chief of Police. The investigation of alleged wrongdoing initiated by Chief Forte then fell into the lap of the new Chief of Police, Rick Smith. Chief Smith has sat on this investigation for nearly 5 years. By not moving forward with the investigation, it appears that Chief Smith is covering up these instances of wrongdoing, and it is believed that the reason for his stall is that he and Brad Lemon are best friends. It's time for justice. The Thomas Simmons story. It is abundantly clear that we must get to the bottom of the inappropriate conduct by officers within the KCPD. This abuse of power and misconduct by a single high-ranking officer within KCPD is nothing more than targeted and selective prosecution. And now that you know it exists, there should be a few questions one should be asking themselves right now. 1. How many other instances of misconduct are performed within the KCPD ranks? 2. What is the motivation behind this sort of misconduct? And finally, what steps are necessary to make certain this type of behavior among those who are sworn to protect and serve is immediately eradicated? And that those who practice such behavior are held accountable for their actions, and the harm they've caused to the citizenry of this great city. It's time for justice. The Thomas Simmons story.